Thank you, Professor Klammer, for your introduction. So hopefully it will be a long but not boring talk. So my title of my talk will be about asylums in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the 19th century. I should say that this is not the history of insane. Okay, so I mean, I will, although I will mention, like what happened to the insane in the 19th century, this will be a history of the state interacting, state responding to insane and insanity or other marginalized classes in the Ottoman Empire. So again, great pleasure to be here. I would like to thank particularly to Professor Ehud Toledano and the staff of Zivi Yavet's School of Historical Studies for making this talk possible. I have to admit that since my dissertation in 2014 at the University of Chicago's Near Eastern Department, I completely put aside my dissertation research and busied myself with teaching responsibilities in Istanbul. I would also like to thank to you for providing me the opportunity to revisit my work, to go back and to look at it and to read it. Okay, so this is an opportunity. Thank you. So what I would like to do in my talk today is to provide you an account of the medical and official policies which contributed to the institutionalization of a new category of the mentally ill and the creation of new official and medical category, the insane. In Ottoman Turkish, it's called mecnun. From Arabic, you all know, which is plural would be mecanin, like the insane. So how this new medical, social, political, and economic category was formularized, this modern conception of insane in the Ottoman Empire, that is one of the questions that I'm going to deal with. The modern 19th century Ottoman official and medical policies that targeted the mentally ill who could be treated in the dedicated medical institutions called bimarhane. Again, it changes in the early modern period. Bimarhane is a general hospital. In the 19th century, it was reformularized and, into an insane asylum. Could be understood with reference to official documents in the form of official correspondences, reports, statistics. Furthermore, personal testimonies also attest to policies which brought the insane under medical gaze in the 19th century. The current talk will be an account of the changing relations between the state and the insane in the 19th century Ottoman Empire. Why and how the former, the state, conceived the latter, the insane, as a distinct social and medical category. What kind of official and medical policies were implemented? In doing so, I will first introduce you what had existed before the arrival of the new medicalized regime, what motivated the official authorities to formularize and give precedence to the institutionalization of insanity. The actors, legal and economic measures that contributed to the onset of this new medical regime, which culminated in the medicalization of the conditions of the insane, who in the previous times, except agitated ones, were allowed to wander freely in the public places. And finally, the outcome of this new medical regime with reference to the conditions of the patients kept in the hospital. So that would be the part that I will try to give you some clues regarding the insane, who were the inmates of the hospital, who were they, where they were coming from, I mean, in what conditions they were living, okay? Maybe, hopefully, I will try to meet the expectations of the workshop, okay? Kind of not exactly dealing with the self, but trying to come with from a bottom-up perspective, try to give some clues so we can discuss it during the Q&A session. So the history of the mentally ill has recently attracted scholarly attention in the Ottoman context. While some of the scholars studied the histories of marginalized groups in general and the insane in particular in different locations and periods, I mean, you all know, Professor Schaffer knows very well, this work, Mecnun by Michael Dawes, is one of them. So there are other people studying disability in the Ottoman context, Marilyn and Mayer studying psychiatry in the Egyptian context, so these are the works that study, insanity in different geographies, settings, and time periods. So there are other works that investigate the histories of and experiences of the insane as part of medical history, and in particular the institutions mentally ill kept their individual histories as provided from the perspective of physicians, okay? So, I mean, recently the two books came out, one by Fatih Artvin, he studied Toptaşı Mental Asylum. So another one, again published by Tarih Vakfı History Foundation in Istanbul, studies doctors and patients, so I mean, they adopt different perspectives. One of them is more kind of an institutional history. The other one is more, like a bottom-up, like a history. I mean, if you're interested, you may go and look at them, So although these existing works examine and discuss topics from various perspectives across diverse geographical settings and groups, however, studying marginality in general and insanity in particular has always been a daunting task for historians, chiefly because we have very limited sources that testify the experiences of the patients. So if you are Ottomanist, I mean, it is really a difficult task, Professor Toledano knows very well, he did a great work, on a slave case, but, it's definitely very difficult, giving voice to those marginalized classes is a difficult task. So, I mean, that is not what I did in my dissertation, okay? Though I was interested, but, it was not possible for me. And as such, the histories that were produced, including myself mostly, were forced to adopt a top-bottom perspective, mainly utilizing the official documents, which reflect the perspectives of the official authorities and medical professionals. Moreover, it is often the voices of the male patients, okay, except few cases, that we hear and encounter in the official documents. So if you're coming from a gender perspective, unfortunately, you have to do more to understand that gender perspective, studying insanity from a gender perspective, okay? It's again, a difficult task, not, you can do it, but you have to put a lot of effort, So a more comprehensive study of the modern mental health policies in the Ottoman context in the case of insanity and insane, in my opinion, okay, has to take into consideration the histories of other groups, okay, such as Armenians, such as Greeks, such as Jewish communities, Jews in the capital, okay? Their institutions and the treatments they provided, okay? So, I mean, Ottoman medicine or insanity is not a matter of only, like a Muslim Ottomans. There were other Ottomans. So their institutions, like the histories of other groups is important. You have to take into consideration. So I tried to do that, but this is something that has to be done, okay? So a sounding examination of the marginalization of the mentally ill, I believe, has to take into consideration the pre-19th century experiences of insanity and its treatment in the Ottoman context. The available testimonies by foreign and Ottoman intellectuals, travelers, and diplomats, as well as archive records, provides us a picture of the insane in the early modern Ottoman Empire. I think this is important, to better understand what was happening, in the 19th century, we have to at least study and understand the periods before the 19th century. Otherwise, I mean, you're in trouble. I'm not an early modern historian, but I try to understand what was the situation of the insane people or the marginalized classes in the period before the modernization, before the modern period. Insanity in the early modern Ottoman Empire did not necessarily constitute a marginal behavior or a pathological condition that required confinement in an institution. In the public, it was only the furiously insane, whose existence was believed to jeopardize public order and security, who were confined in small cells that were attached to the general hospitals called Darushifa or Bimarhane. Others were kept at home and subjected to the private care of families. The insane, apart from the uncontrollable and violent, were allowed to wander freely in the public and participate in communal life. Okay, I'm not trying to generalize, but the existing accounts suggest that there are different experiences of insanity and marginality. So I am trying to claim that in the early modern period, it was, the state's concern was, only those furious or those agitated ones, which were believed to, disrupt public order. So Ghislaine de Busbecq, who served as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, writes that there are many categories, by the way, in the early modern period. A number of terms that I should introduce was, that they use for the mentally disabled persons, like divane, deli, meczup, mecnun. Okay, there are multiple terms that they use to define. Okay, so on the other hand, in the 19th century, we will see that they will reduce those terms into some medically, politically defined categories, okay? So Busbecq, who served as the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, writes that these holy fools were usually, meaning deli or divane or meczup, okay? Usually claimants to various kinds of sanctity who wander from place to place begging under the cloak of religion. Many of them were pretending to be weak-minded as an excuse for begging, for persons of this kind always find favor with the Turks, who think that those who are half-witted and crazy, being certainly predestined to go to heaven, are to be regarded as saints during their life on earth. This and other accounts, such as that of prominent Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi, who met a local holy idiot named Şehbekyar the Naked in the marketplace in Damascus, suggest that these people were allowed to wander in public places without any inquiry or intervention. However, Antonio Menavino, a Genoese who spent 10 years as a slave in the courts of Bayezid II, Selim I, notes that the warders, called güllabis, okay, went around the city with staffs, collected the furious insane, and put iron chains around their neck and wrists and brought to the hospital. The inmates of the cells in the hospitals mostly composed of unmanageable and incurable chronic patients or the insane who were considered by the official authorities as potential threats to social order. Once they were admitted to hospital, they were put under the control of warders who were responsible for their provisioning and discipline. Güllabis were the actual administrators who both ran the insane section and administered therapy with the clubs that they were carrying. Hospitals were not only institutions in the cities where the insane were confined and provided care. The insane were also kept in the cells attached to certain mosques known as Vüzera camileri. The Christian communities had their own institutions for the management and care of the insane. The Greek Orthodox community, for instance, had a convent on the island of Prinkipo, and since the Byzantine times was one of the places where the insane were put under the care of its patron Saint George. In the early modern Ottoman society, in the absence of organized official institutional care, concerning the insane, violent and unmanageable insanity, which in the modern period was subsumed under the name of Mecnun and relegated to the bimarhane, mostly had been considered a private matter except where public safety or legal questions were concerned. Thus, in the period before the 19th century, the handling of the insane was identified first and foremost as a domestic and a communal responsibility. So the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire were characterized by rapid change and unrest, a period, I argue, combined with the other concerns and calculations, which also marks a change in the policies toward the disenfranchised urban poor, and the gradual segregation and relegation of the insane to the dedicated institutions. I think the 19th century, this is a common periodization. I think that it's a turning point for the insane, all the marginal classes, and including the insane. A long period of war in the late 18th century led to heavy taxation in the countryside, as well as general insecurity and brigandage. In these circumstances, the Ottoman Empire experienced a flight to the cities with large number of people attempting to migrate to urban areas. The existence of large numbers of socially unmoored individuals, i.e., people who were not firmly embedded in neighborhoods and communities through marriage, extended family ties, or work connections such as guilds, became a source of ongoing concern for the state, especially in large and politically significant cities like Istanbul and Edirne. In short, there developed a fear of the mob, or meçhulül ahval, which means foreigners of uncertain demeanor, as the Ottomans termed this group. Okay, so in several documents, I will show you some documents. There was this concern of meçhulül ahval, so they were foreigners of uncertain demeanor. This fear of the mob was not entirely unfounded. Indeed, the first half of the 18th century has been defined by two large popular rebellions with the span of a single decade: the Patrona Halil rebellion in 1730 and the Market rebellion in 1740. The anxiety of meçhulül ahval manifested itself in orders and regulations meant to control the public appearance and movement of individuals deemed problematic. Having been attacked in Friday prayer in Hagia Sophia Mosque, Selim III, in an imperial decree addressing the deputy governor, complained about the inattentiveness of the officers to control the streets full of beggars, dervishes, lunatics, and stressed the need for their control. Like Selim III, Mahmud II ordered the expulsion, which is tardu tebid, of unidentified persons from the city and prevention of the potential migrants entering the city. In 1835-36, Mahmud II ordered the heads of the religious establishments, dergahs and hankahs, the issuance of tezkires, travel licenses, to their members and expulsion of unidentified persons, especially those holy idiots called meczup that were residing in mosques, tekkes, and hankahs. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th century, the Ottoman state undertook a massive reform program and restructuring. The reforms got off an abortive start under Selim III, were launched in earnest under Mahmud II, and vastly expanded in the period between Tanzimat and deposition of Abdülhamid II. An important aspect of this process was a steadily increasing interaction with European intellectual life, social arrangements, and government policies. So I am not trying to suggest that it is only those security measures which resulted in their gradual marginalization, okay? Not kind of suggesting a Freudian explanation of social control, okay? So I think that also there was this reformist side, and that was important to understand this gradual marginalization. Just as the Ottomans admired, critiqued, and adapted the military and elite educational institutions they observed in other countries, so too they were intrigued by the new institutions they encountered for managing the population at large. Registration of domicile and internal transit documents for policing, widespread state-sponsored education, and the dissemination of newspapers, government gazettes, journals for shaping opinion, the collection of census data and statistics for measuring economic capacity and potential conscripts. These were, I mean, when you read the memoirs of the Ottoman bureaucrats, let's say in European capitals, you see that they were really admired and, you know, like emphasizing these modern technologies. These developments, I argue, had two consequences for the insane. On the one hand, they increasingly became the object of state suspicion, scrutiny, and control as anxiety about the subversive and dangerous character of Meçhulül Ahval grew. On the other hand, as they went by, this increased scrutiny, together with the growing awareness on the part of Ottoman bureaucrats concerning institutional developments in Europe, combined to make the insane a distinct subcategory of Meçhulül Ahval. Okay, in the 19th century, there was this fear of mob, there was this fear of Meçhulül Ahval, and there were all sorts of people, you know, like under this category. But gradually, you know, like I think, you know, like based on these concerns, they gradually segregated this category into small groups, and insane, I think, was one of those groups, okay? So Ottoman statesmen in Europe were quite struck by the modern institutions that were designed to cater the needy. Bureaucrats sent on foreign missions and who had the chance to closely observe the functioning of hospitals, orphanages, and asylums in European capitals submitted reports to the government that included depictions of the functioning of modern institutions. So one of them was Mustafa Sami Efendi, who served in the Ottoman embassy in Paris between 1838 and 1839. He underlined the significance of modern mental health services and the reform of the conditions of the mentally ill. Okay, he was not the only person. You know, like there were other persons. So in Seyahatname, Londra, again, you have similar references. I mean, if you read them, you see them. They always mention those modern institutions, those modern practices. So I'm not suggesting that it's only those policy measures. Okay, so equally they were influenced, they were motivated to, you know, like to reform the conditions of those, you know, like classes. Thus, we may say that at the turn of the 18th to 19th century, in the Ottoman government began to impose new regulations to control the movements of its marginalized populations and keep them under a close scrutiny more generally. Within this, the insane gradually began to be distinguished as a specific subclass. So what kind of policies did the Ottoman government, you know, like promulgated to organize, to differentiate this class? Okay, so I will be looking at, you know, like judicial aspects of these policies, economy, and, you know, like finally what happened to the insane in the 19th century. Okay, no need to mention when you look at the population censuses. Again, you see some, you know, like traces of this segregation. Okay, I don't know whether you look at population censuses in 1830s. You see that the insane are, you know, like differentiated from other people. Okay, a close look at the population censuses show that after the second quarter of the 19th century, the insane were registered under various headings such as Mejnun, Meczup, Deli, and classified as crippled, Mande, because of not meeting the expected role by the modern state. And furthermore, these census records suggest the persons who were identified as unfit were mostly kept at homes. Okay? So as the century progressed, the first efforts of establishing designated or dedicated mental asylums began to emerge. This coincided with fiscal reforms arising from the new efforts at centralization, one whose effect was to undermine the financial stability of those charitable institutions, usually supported by Vakıf foundations. You know, the Mahmud II, actually, he confiscated the properties of Vakıfs. And, you know, like when I looked at the documents, you know, like, I'm not sure, I'm suggesting that also the dissolution of Vakıf system, those imares also, you know, like helping those indigent people, poor people, you know, like was a serious blow to their conditions. And, you know, like gradually they appeared in public places as a problem group, okay? So finally, the reforms obviously were an avenue of opportunity for those trained in new methods, a new era which was administered by modernizing bureaucrats, which Timothy Mitchell designates as the rule of experts, whether Ottomans or Europeans in Ottoman service. The carriers of figures like Luigi Mongeri, the first, you know, like chief physician of the Süleymaniye and Toptaşı Mental Hospital, and his protege Avram de Castro are emblematic of this, you know, like a rule of experts. Okay, so this is Avram de Castro, and he was the again chief physician of Toptaşı Mental Hospital after, you know, like Luigi Mongeri. Okay, Mongeri was an Italian physician who arrived in Istanbul and rose to the position of chief physician of Süleymaniye and Toptaşı mental asylums after serving in several branches and posts in Ottoman medical organization. Avram de Castro was a graduate of the Imperial Medical College, Mektebi Fünuni Tıbbiye, who had trained in France and Italy. Such figures naturally pressed for the expansion of treatment and treatment facilities within the state's purview on both modernist and humanitarian grounds. I am trying to suggest, I'm not trying to speculate, but I think that they have some professional concerns as well as, you know, like some reformist claims to reform the conditions of the insane kept in those institutions. These three factors, combined with continuing difficult economic and security circumstances in many provinces, meaning, you know, like dissolution of Vakıfs, states, you know, like policies targeting meçhulül ahval, I think interacted dynamically both to expand and centralize the institutional treatment of the insane from mid-century onwards, and also ultimately to create a crisis of overcrowding and financing in those newly created institutions in the last quarter of the century. So what I'm trying to say is, I mean, not a progressive history. Okay, maybe they try to, you know, reform the conditions of the insane or the marginalized groups, but the outcome, you know, like was different than they expected, you know, like, so overcrowding, when you read the documents in the 19th century, was one of the, you know, like chronic problems that the asylum administrators constantly complaining about, okay? So at the end, we will see, you know, that, you know, like many people will die because of those, you know, like epidemics. So in this part of my talk, I would like to consider some of the official policies in the form of legislative and economic measures that contributed to the institutionalization of mental medicine and subsequently brought the mental ill under the purview of professionals in dedicated hospitals. I will start with the role of alienists, mainly Luigi Mongeri, and his employment of statistics and other measures in making the new category of mental illness a palpable reality for the official authorities on the one hand and for the public on the other. So I think that, you know, like statistics in Süleymaniye were important tools of, you know, like for Mongeri, you know, like a professional, you know, like a agenda maybe to make insane, you know, like observable, to make them maybe to underline their conditions, because he was not very fond of the Ottoman government. He was complaining that they do not realize what he is doing. So I think he used statistics, you know, like to underline this phenomenon called insanity. So in the second quarter of the 19th century, various official attempts to improve the conditions of the mental ill did not produce the intended results, primarily because the empire lacked the trained medical personnel needed to implement them. So what I'm trying to suggest here, you know, like not coming up with a story of Luigi Mongeri coming and, you know, like reforming Ottoman institutions, but on the other hand, there were attempts to reform the conditions of the insane kept in different hospitals at the capital before the arrival of Mongeri. So in 1856, Mongeri, I mean, he was in the Ottoman Empire long before 1856, in 1839. So he was in Pavia. He graduated from Pavia and then came to Istanbul in 1839, joined the forces, Ottoman forces at the Battle of Nizip, came back to Istanbul, went to Ottoman quarantine station at Sinop, and then ended up in Crete, where he would meet his patron. So this is a dilekçe, this is his letter to the government, you know, like demanding a position, demanding at the Süleymaniye mental asylum. So, I mean, we will talk about Mongeri's career, but definitely it is interesting to study, you know, like why he ended up in Ottoman Empire. He was a graduate of one of the Italian universities, Pavia, and he ended up in Ottoman Empire. I mean, I have some answers, but, you know, like since time is limited, you know, like I have to move forward. In 1856, then conditions were ripe for Mongeri, still in private practice in the imperial capital, to submit this letter to the authorities. So this document suggests that its author was informed about the ongoing negotiations in the Sanitary Council. Mongeri acknowledged the value of the early reform measures, including the merger of Haseki and Sultanahmet Hospital, as well as the government appointment of 2 physicians to cater the patients at Süleymaniye. Nevertheless, he underlines that the Süleymaniye Asylum could not be compared to other institutions, for its inmates required special treatment owing to the specific nature of their illnesses. Thus, they had to be treated separately. He was claiming some sort of expertise. He says basically to the Ottoman authorities that, guys, I know that you are trying to, you know, like reform their conditions, but I am an expert, okay? I know how to treat them, okay? So demanding a position. So finally, he was appointed on 1 April 1856, and he became the chief physician of the Süleymaniye Mental Asylum. I don't know whether you know where Süleymaniye is, but it's on the, I mean, some of you know, it's on the European side, okay? So a few months after Mongeri's appointment, a short piece in Gazette Médicale d'Orient, which was published by Imperial Medical Society, drew the attention of its readers to a particular form of insanity called homicidal monomania, and to the potential threats that those afflicted might pose to their environment if proper measures were not set in place. I mean, this is almost, you know, like after the appointment of Mongeri, okay? He was writing to this journal, okay? So in the first incident, 2 men armed with daggers had boarded a steamship bound from Trabzon to Istanbul, attacked the passengers, killed some of them, and wounded many on the spot. In the second, an insane who had been treated in a Rufai Sufi convent escaped and killed 6 people, also with a knife. These 2 short pieces, on one hand, pointed out the potential dangerous acts that the insane might commit in the public places if allowed to socialize freely, but on the other, they also heralded the commencement of a medical mission. I think this is not a coincidence, you know, like I tend to use it as you know, like heralding that mission, you know, like so you should not basically allow those guys, I know them, who they are, I know how to treat them, you should not allow them wander freely, okay? So, I mean, institutions are the right places to help them, okay? Not to let them, you know, like wander in the public places. A pamphlet penned by Mongeri that was published in 1867 under the title Statistical Notes on Süleymaniye Mental Asylum, and that utilizes the statistical numbers from Süleymaniye and other communal hospitals, is useful in explaining Mongeri's professional appropriation of so-called Oriental insanity in scientific and medical discourse. So in French psychiatric circles, actually, there was this discussion on Oriental insanity. If you read French alienists, you know, like visiting, you know, like a Middle East Ottoman lands, you know, like they were formularizing this notion of Oriental insanity, okay? So I think that, you know, like that was some sort of a communication by Mongeri with that you know, like Oriental insanity discussion. Published first in Gazette Médicale d'Orient and later independently, the piece presents findings based on not only the Süleymaniye statistics, that is, records kept on the patients there during Mongeri's tenure, but also on patient statistics from Greek Balıklı and Armenian Yedikule hospitals. Mongeri presented the findings from this statistical survey at the 1864 meeting of the French Société Médico-Psychologique, the professional organization of French psychiatrists, to which he was accepted as a foreign associate member of the, at the same year. Okay, so he was also the member of, like Italian, French, German, like a psychiatric, professional psychiatric associations. Okay, so I think that allowed him, like to present himself as an expert of Oriental insanity. So I will move forward. This clinical statistics that Mongeri collected in this regard, placing insanity into comprehensive categories, were instrumental in medicalizing mental illness and in ultimately relegating it to the experts known as alienists, who were armed with modern medical techniques. Moreover, statistics were the means of elevating the Italian doctors' moral treatment program to a scientific status, one that required treatment in institutions dedicated to this purpose. So this is a chart from, that I put into Excel, but we have to talk about these charts, these numbers, and what you don't see there or what you see there. Maybe we can do that at the end of the Q&A session, okay? So during Q&A session, statistics also serve the purpose of rendering insanity visible and of thus creating a manageable social category. At the same time, they allowed alienists to establish themselves and their asylums as the only institutions designed specifically to effect cure. The decay of institutions that was evident by the late 19th century, the potential dangers that the insane persons might pose to the public, and the modern technology of visualization by quantification opened the way for medical professionals' redefinition of popularly accepted behavior as insanity. So when you read Mongeri's report, you see that he is always trying to address those other dervish groups or, lodges who were equally claiming some sort of expertise, okay, trying to depopularize their treatment. So this is another, a chart that shows the female patients admitted to Süleymaniye Hospital. And this one as a chart that compares the numbers of male and female patients. Maybe we have to think about these numbers, okay? Why we have less females than males? What was the reason for that? Why Mongeri? How Mongeri explaining this disparity and difference? On the other hand, when you look at the statistics, the flatness of the data presented in the tables, the failure to account for patients' social categories such as social, economic, and ethnic backgrounds suggests that the main concern alienists had in using such a technology was not so much the exploration of the real causes of mental affliction as it was to render it, as I have mentioned, comprehensible, concrete, and visible to the authorities. The very means of presentation creates the illusion of uniformity in the patient population by lumping various sorts of conditions into a single category. The flatness of the data in the tables suggests that it was not a concern for Mongeri to really evaluate the etiological nature of the illnesses. The object, as I have explained, was to call for an official intervention. I think he was trying to make the authorities, to take their attention regarding, the potential dangers, the dimensions of the case.
What was the size of the population at the time in Istanbul?
I don't know exactly. Maybe 1.5 million. I don't have the. No, these numbers are from all Ottoman Empire, not only from Istanbul, because that was the institution receiving patients. Let's say receiving people from all across the empire. So. Yeah, less, as you see, that was another problem for Mongeri and other French psychiatrists when they explained this Oriental insanity thing, so why do we have, the numbers are so, less compared to, let's say, France, okay? So that was the claim, okay, this Oriental insanity thesis, okay? So that they claim that has to do with civilization, okay? So those guys are not civilized, they are not preoccupied their minds. So that's why we have less numbers here compared to French, the numbers, let's say, in French institutions. Okay, that is definitely an interesting topic that we have to deal with. But the other problem is that since he was pressing for an acknowledgement, the other concern was that how to come up with a legal framework that the institution where the insane were accepted, could be administered, okay? So that there was a lacuna with respect to the legislation, okay? So how would you, administer, how would you control admissions and discharges? Okay, that was another concern of Luigi Mongeri when you look at his, writings. So, I mean, in the late Ottoman period, Islamic law, as you all know, was ambiguous regarding the status of mentally ill persons and often treated in a cursory manner. All four schools, Maliki, Hanbali, and Hanafi and Shafi, known as Mehtabs, had differing legal perspectives on cases involving the insane. Insanity was mostly discussed in relation to legal disability within the broad areas of contracts and legal and religious obligations. No further stipulations were made concerning the mental patient's admission to and discharge from institutions or concerning the administration of those establishments. That was Mongeri's chief concern, to, have the government accept his, a regulation that he prepared, okay? So, but before that, however, before the 1876 regulation, which was called Bimarhanelere Dair Nizamname, the regulation concerning mental asylums, insanity was gradually brought under the purview of Ottoman judicial system. Although, I mean, there were not clear, articles addressing insanity in those, other legal texts, before 1876, insanity brought under the purview of Ottoman judicial system. As part of Tanzimat reforms in the judicial field, the first penal code enacted was the Criminal Code of 1814, and in 1858, another penal code after 1840, which adopted the French 1810 Code Penal, brought insanity for the first time under juridical scrutiny. According to Article 41 of the Ottoman Code, quoting from the code, if it is proved that the offender was in a state of insanity at the time when he committed an offense, he is held exempt from legal punishment. In spite of the article's reference to proof, there is no mention as to how or by what authority an offender's insanity might be proved. Although there was a reference to insanity cases in the criminal code, there were no details. So I will proceed. However, these legal accommodations do not outline the practices of psychiatric profession or the administration of mental asylums. So you have an institution, but there are no laws, there are no regulations concerning the administration and admissions and discharges. The legislation that regulated civil medical affairs included no article about the insane or the institutions which they were kept. Until the second half of the 19th century, no official provisions existed governing either the admissions and discharge of the mentally ill to hospitals or the practice of mental medicine. Given the lack of legal procedures for admission and medical certification, Luigi Mongeri argued that patients of all kinds, including senile persons, epileptics, were being sent to the asylum, further contributing to the problem of overcrowding. So I think one of the concerns, during this time was this overcrowding problem, and, Mongeri was proposing, when he was legitimizing this, the necessity of this regulation, he was saying that that would be a measure to prevent this flow of patients, okay, so that we can, by the regulation, charging doctors as experts, we can identify who is really insane or not, so that to prevent, overcrowding, in the asylum. Another case that he was dealing, when you read the regulation, where there were some illegal confinement cases. So he was citing certain cases that there were some, men and women who were illegally confined in their communal hospitals. He said that, that would be a solution to definitely to overcome all these problems. Okay, so. The first draft of the regulation remained on the shelves at the Ministry of more than 7 years. However, in 1876, after considering and approving the amendments, the Council of State, as the empire's supreme legislative organ, passed Mongeri's legislation on 22 March 1876. So I'm not going to go in details of the regulation. It is a total of 22 articles. Believe me or not, still, in Turkey, there is no, a regulation. This is the first and only regulation in Turkey, that is still in effect, okay? So, a couple of years ago, when I was in, Bakırköy Mental Hospital, for my dissertation defense, they were, the Ministry of Health was considering to, prepare a new regulation. I'm not saying that this regulation is in effect, but this was the first and the only regulation. So, the regulation proposed a centrally controlled asylum system. According to regulation, no one, regardless of nationality, may open or direct an establishment designated for the insane without the authorization of the government. Further, any request for admission would contain the name, profession, age, and nationality and domicile of the person, according to Article 4 of the regulation. This regulation, the 1876 regulation, unlike laws of earlier periods, for the first time brought insanity under state and medical scrutiny, charging police and physicians in the cities, as well as the Council of Elders, İhtiyar Meclisi, and religious heads, imams, in the rural areas with contributing to the management of mentally ill persons. The 1876 regulation, by expanding and maintaining medicine's control on insanity, also contributed to the institutionalization of pseudo, like a science, let's say psychiatry, in the 19th century Ottoman Empire. The new law integrated the implementers, that is, doctors, of this new branch of medicine into the state apparatus and provided a legitimate ground for their intervention in insanity cases as medical experts. In contrast to earlier ambivalent descriptions of insanity, I mean, remember the pre-19th century descriptions, like the categories that were used that were referring to insane. The 1876 regulation designated the condition of officially as a sickness that could be treated only in special institutions, that is, bimarhanes, under the management of doctors. So I think legally and technically, the regulation and Mongeri was suggesting two clear, terminologies. One is Mejnun is an insane person, okay? Just forget deli, forget meczup, okay? Mejnun is the medical category, and bimarhane is no longer a general hospital, okay? It is a dedicated, let's say, institution that was dedicated, to keep them, under control, okay? So, I mean, yes, I mean, it was first Süleymani and then Toptaşı was the official, asylums of the Ottoman Empire, but there was one problem, okay? There was a constant flow of patients, and they didn't have finances to cater the needs of the inmates of the hospitals, okay? Basically, I mean, there were 600 patients living inside, a building, okay, without proper hygiene, ventilation, okay? So it was a catastrophe for patients. So in 1873, okay, they abandoned Süleymaniye. After a cholera epidemic, they moved to, to Toptaşı on the Asian side, and as soon as they moved to Toptaşı, they realized that, they can't cater the needs. No one helping them. There was no budget, nothing, okay? So in this part, I want to consider a tax on insanity, okay? So at the face of increasing patient numbers, a comprehensive and radical plan to transform Toptaşı into a modern mental asylum, however, given the particularities of the period, would not be an easy undertaking. In response to the rising number of mental patients coming from other provinces and districts, a phenomenon that asylum administrators constantly emphasize in their official correspondence, the government was forced to initiate a construction program to increase the facility's capacity, okay? So they were not able to, so no money. So in that case, Mongeri came up with, with a solution. So he proposed the creation of a central budget, a central budget known as bimarhane masrafı, funded by annual taxes, vergi senevi, obtained from provinces and districts to finance the expenses of Toptaşı, the empire's new mental asylum after 1873. However, the complex Ottoman politics, as you all know, it's not an easy time period. It's the late 19th century. There are many financial problems, politics and economics of the time, coupled with the province's opposition to contribute to the central asylum budget, curtailed the implementation of the reform program. So I will again move, introduce you the budget, okay? So here you see the name of districts and, and on the other side, you have the modern renderings of the names. So, according to the negotiations held at the Commission's special convocation, Meclis-i Mahsus, the asylum's expenses would be subsidized from funds collected from the provinces under the label asylum expenses, bimarhane masrafı, which Mongeri also called an annual tax, vergi senevi, effectively a tax on insanity. According to the Commission's plan, the funds, which totaling a 5 kuruş, so 500,000 kuruş, would be paid by the listed 27 provinces and districts from 1875 onwards, that is with the institutionalization of the tax. the funds would be collected and deposited in the local branches of the banks, and then the collected amount would be transferred to the Dersaadet Bankası in the capital. From there, the money would be delivered to the asylum. In short, the provinces and districts were to forward specific annual amounts to the capital in return for the privilege of sending patients to the central asylum. So when you read the documents, you will see that the document, like the negotiations, also categorize the patients. Okay, you have well-to-do patients, okay, you have poor patients, and there are fees depending on their social statuses. So one of the problems, did this proposal work? It didn't, okay? So they collected some money, but most of the provinces refused to pay money because they didn't have budgets. So some of the provinces had their own institutions, okay, like Manisa, okay, or like Damascus. When they were responding to the central government, they said, we're not going to contribute because we already have our own institutions. We have to take care of those institutions. So that didn't work. That didn't work. They were not able to finance, to reform the conditions of the insane kept at the mental asylum. So what happened? You have the increasing numbers of patients on the one side, and a lack of finances, and trying to find a patron to cater the needs of the insane. Unfortunately, it didn't work. They were not able to stop the overcrowding problem. They were not able to cater the needs of the inmates of the asylum. Okay, so if the above taken measures were meant to elevate the condition of the mentally ill, that is, regulation, a budget, the outcome did not produce the intended results. So I would like to briefly describe some of the problems in the form of overcrowding and cholera that ravaged the wards of the mental asylum and the solutions sought by the official authorities. So as discussed above, overcrowding had remained a chronic problem for asylum authorities since the second half of the 19th century. By the 1890s, official communications indicate the mental asylum's population had reached a total of 550 to 600 patients, okay? So this is not a proper, institution, okay? It's a building, it's a couple of rooms, and you have 600 people piled in those rooms, okay? So that was, the conditions were really awful. In order to stem the flow of patients from countryside, the government sent several directives to the provinces that officially banned the transportation of mental patients to the capital. But these measures, which were intended to relieve the pressure of numbers in Istanbul's asylum, did not halt the increase or resolve the associated problems. 20 to 25 patients were simply piled into rooms that should really have housed 5 or 6 at most. Given the lack of space, some patients who had not been admitted to the asylum were kept in the hospital at the general prison. Okay, they were keeping some of the patients in the general prison. Okay, so basically, the asylum in the late 19th century was, as you see in other cases in Europe, was a storage house. So they put there, and technically, they didn't have enough means to serve them, okay? So what kind of patients were there? Like the senile, epileptics, and other chronically ill persons filled asylum wards. So the factors that contributed to the overcrowding problem in the Ottoman Empire's central mental asylum were not distinct from the ones observed in other countries. Following the merger of hospitals in 1844 and the designation of Süleymaniye as the empire's central mental asylum, the number of those institutionalized patients increased, as visible in the statistical tables that Luigi Mongeri compiled for the years between 1857 and 1867. So this is not the case only for Ottoman mental institutions. If you go to communal hospitals, you will see that there is a similar trend, a rise in patients admitted to the institutions. Let me go back and show you this chart, which is a comparison of blue one is Süleymaniye, and the other one is Greek Balıklı Hospital. All the hospitals were filled with patients, so although that Toptaşı Hospital was designated and designed as the Empire's Central Lunatic Asylum, so it was receiving patients from all communities, okay? I will come to that, who they were, and how did they end up in Toptaşı Mental Asylum. So,
About 10 minutes.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. Yeah. So what happened in 1913 was there was a cholera outbreak, and the cholera outbreak struck the asylum, and let's say 114 patients, including asylum inmates, died during the cholera epidemic. At the time when cholera struck the mental asylum, it was hosting a population of 500 to 550 patients from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. With the asylum staff, the attendants, civil personnel, and doctors, the number of residents reached a total of 600. The patient list prepared by Avram Castro, Dr. Castro, also provides interesting details concerning patient profiles and the factors that contributed to the chronic overcrowding. Of the total 112 patients who fell ill during the cholera epidemic in the asylum, 12 belonged to the Christian and Jewish millets. There were Jewish patients, there were Greek patients, there were Armenian patients, there were like Muslim patients. All of them were in this central asylum facility. That is only 10% of the patients who fell ill during the epidemic had come from non-Muslim communities, and of 13 non-Muslim patients, 8 were Jewish and 4 belonged to Greek or Armenian Orthodox millets. The high percentage of Jewish patients suggests that the Jewish millet often sent patients to the central lunatic asylum because by that time they didn't have their own hospital in the capital. Or Hayim, like it will be established, if I'm not wrong, like a couple of years after that. They were working on a hospital, but negotiating with the government. But by the time there was this epidemic, they didn't, as far as I remember. So I came across cases, that were, Jewish patients being sent to, a Toptaşı asylum and sent back to Rabbinite to take care of them, and again sent back to the asylum because, if you're the government and if you're claiming to serve your, subjects, that you have to accept them. But unfortunately, there was no place, the Greek community was keeping their, patients in their own communal hospitals, Armenian in their own communal hospitals, but however, they were not able to receive and all the patients. So why did the cholera epidemic have deadly consequences for the patients in the asylum? Apart from the unsanitary conditions in which the patients were living, the epidemic had caught the asylum administration unprepared. As cholera cases in other parts of the city demonstrate, the medical authorities were not experienced enough to correctly diagnose cholera. So there was a commission. In the commission, they were not able to diagnose it. There were discussions. What is that? What is, how can we treat it? There were discussions, at the end, they tried to transfer all the patients to one of the islands in Marmara Sea. And all of a sudden, someone realized that, if you transfer them, that means that you can communicate the disease to the city. So Abdülhamid was very, an obsessive figure, obsessed with, the case. So because, he was afraid that that would turn into a, a citywide epidemic. So that was, there were discussions when there was this cholera epidemic in the mental asylum, when the patients were dying. So they were also considering different alternative solutions. But at the end, they gave up the transportation of, patients to another institution. So these are some of the patients that were kept in Toptaşı Mental Asylum. So you see some of them if you have been to the, a building. So this was one of the courtyards where they were keeping, a male and female patients. Okay, so these are male patients. Okay, so let me show you another picture. This picture was, a picture again from the courtyard of Toptaşı Mental Asylum, where you see the, the insane were socializing. Okay, so this is another image. So another image. Probably, by that time there was a camera in the asylum. Okay, so the camera was used to, record take the pictures of the patients. Particularly, open file for the patients. I'm not able to, come across those accounts. I know that they are somewhere, but it is an interesting, it would be an interesting study to go to those patient files to study, the treatment program, who were they, where they were coming from. So this was a plan that was, again, submitted to the government to expand the existing medical facility. Okay, so at the end of the cholera case, they were considering to build a new mental asylum, modern mental asylum. However, they couldn't. Okay, so again, by that time, they were not able to. Now, until the Republican times, until today, there was no, officially designated purpose-built mental asylum building. There were some plans in the archives, like detailing the central mental asylum, but it was not realized. So this one is, like an extension plan. So when there was this overcrowding problem, they proposed to extend the building, build some, like a new 2-story buildings inside the existing facility. So this is the picture that shows the entrance of the Toptaşı Mental Asylum. So you see behind the entrance, like the building where the insane were kept, these are the buildings where the insane were kept. So again, let me remind you that, they kept female and male patients in different wards, okay? So this one, shows patients during a visit by Asylum's medical staff. Again, a picture from Toptaşı Mental Asylum. It's another picture that shows a group of patients, inside the building. And here, most of you would probably know this guy, Mazhar Osman, the first, who was claimed to be the father of Turkish psychiatry, unchaining patients in Edirne Hospital. This is a very, popular instance, where he was unchaining, freeing patients from their, restrictions. So I would like to stop here. Thank you for your attention. So if you have questions, because I will read and read and read, so if you have questions so that we can have a Q&A session, I will try to answer your questions, thank you for your attention.
I think the first observation is that you did not speak fast enough.
Really? I tried.
Yes, please. Yes. Just introduce yourself to our distinguished guest.
My name is Sergey.
Yes, introduce yourself.
My name is Sergey and study Asian studies, and I would ask you a question that has to do something with Russia.
Yeah.
I want you to compare the torture case to Russia. I know
Yeah.
that in the end of the 19th century in Russia there were many national minorities, and the medicine was mobilized by the state to strengthen for the national property purposes, and I know that Russian physicians always often told that some of national minorities are more susceptible to mental diseases.
Yeah.
And for example, Russian physicians were sent to Poland, to Ukraine, and when they treated patients, they told that he is a Jew, so he is more susceptible to mental diseases.
Uh-huh.
And in this way, they the Russian state tried to russify the national minorities by saying that their national minorities are more susceptible to be insane than Russians. So I know that in the end of the 19th century, Ottoman Empire was multinational state. It had many nations, Armenians, Jews. Was it the case in Turkey that the state tried to mobilize the
Psychiatry?
physicians and to decide who is insane and who is not? This was the case in Russia.
Okay.
Russian medicians told that Russians to be Russian is normal, and to be Jew is perhaps not. But to give you some cases, there were trials in Russia. For example, a famous case was this Jewish man his name is Baylis. He was it was a very famous trial. Police arrested him and told that he killed a Russian child for the ritual. And it was medicine case. Some Russian physicians told it couldn't happen, and some told it could happen because Jews can do it for the ritual. It became also the medical case.
Yeah.
Was it something? Did something
No.
similar happen in Turkey?
I'm not. I didn't come across any cases like that. So Maybe there are. We have to look at patient cases. But as far as I remember, there were no such cases. And also note that Castro was the chief physician until the constitutional revolution, 1908. Not even in the case of Armenians or Greeks. Okay, they had their communal hospitals, but we have to look at it. I don't want to suggest that.
The Castro a Jew?
Yeah, the Castro is Avram de Castro. So, yeah. So it's an interesting case to consider, but I didn't see any cases.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Uri Rosberg. I'm researching modern Turkish history, so
Yeah.
a bit later than the period. And I'm working with some jamaats in Turkey, Naqshbandiyas especially. And I wonder if you look top down at how insanity was pushed aside.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you look at the discourse inside the spiritual centers that you said that in the past they absorbed all these semi-crazy people and this. And today when we go to such places in Turkey, we see that it's much more clean, sterile, almost it's less. So I wonder if there was a change discourse also in these kind of
You mean
Sufi,
you mean the role of
Religious institutions.
were they pushing these people away too?
They tried, but they were not successful. They were still there. I'm not suggesting that modern medicine came, just impose its modern techniques, and all the Ottomans and Turkish citizens accepted those, modern. What modern medicine, promised them. Still, I think these two different sorts of treatments, popular, religious, and a modern, medicine or treatment methods or institutions existed side by side. Although, still, if you go to Anatolia, there were many, lodges and places where they still treat certain, mentally deranged or problematic persons.
But seeing them as not as religiously enlightened, did that also change what in this whole medical revolution? You said in the 18th century, these people were seen a bit like saints almost, not just crazy people, some divine knowledge.
So I think in the public places, in the big cities, yes, changed. They were not allowed to especially wander freely, okay? But in Anatolia, in other places, probably, if I didn't get wrong, what you were trying to say, to meczup, holy fool, they were able to, wander freely, even though there was this medicine, organized medicine. I'm not suggesting that organized medicine came all of a sudden, changed everything, confined all these, marginalized people, behaviors, and, and the asylum was the sole institution to accept and to confine them. No, for the Ottoman Empire, this is not possible to suggest, such an explanation. And I am personally not the person to say that, that was the case, okay?
Looking at the numbers, just a comment. I tried to refer to this earlier. Looking at the numbers, you're talking about a few hundreds of people. Okay. In an empire that included many millions.
Yeah.
So it couldn't have been more than an extremely marginal phenomenon.
You mean the numbers? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're talking about very, very. It's not talking about a network of modernized institutions. You're talking about one or two institutions.
Yeah.
You're talking about institutions in which some of the people are even epileptics, so we wouldn't even define them as insane, if you want to call mentally sick. Some of them are, and the rest, if I understand correctly, are mostly the violent insane. Okay?
Yeah.
So how important was it? How widespread was this? It seems that most insane people were still being treated elsewhere, either in religious institutions, in local institutions, in families.
Yeah.
Is this something that had any impact on Turkish culture?
The numbers, you mean?
Yeah.
The numbers, as far as I can provide, were not intended for the Turkish public.
No, I understand that, but we're talking about a very, very small group.
So because why the numbers are really low, right? Hundreds for an empire.
I'm assuming there's a certain number of insane people in any society.
Yeah.
And since I'm not a racist, I don't think that people in the East are
More
saner or less
susceptible.
sane than others. Okay. So given that we're talking about an empire of what?
Millions. 20,
Okay,
yeah.
20 million.
Yeah.
And you're talking here about what? 600 people.
600 people, yeah.
600 people.
Yeah.
So, what is the meaning of this? Most people, assuming that they were treated elsewhere.
Yeah.
And probably were treated in traditional ways. In what way did this mental hospital affect the treatment of people outside this very, very small institution in Istanbul?
Probably not, probably just trying to pose an image of, like a kind of, to make it, known that there is such an institute. He says that basically, trying to explain the numbers, so these are numbers that did not and that do not reflect the existing numbers of mentally disabled people. You're right, so probably he was trying to attract the attention of authorities, maybe, so we have to think about numbers, I am not jumping on numbers, but why he's using statistics, because statistics is not only about a matter of numbers, we know that in the French case they were using those numbers, related
Did they
to
have specific methods that are highly publicized? Was this a model hospital in any way?
He tried it as a model hospital, his claim was that that this should be Süleymani, and then Toptaşı should be a purpose-built, dedicated kind of institution, a model institution. You cannot. This is no longer a Darüşşifa, a general hospital. This is a mental asylum. So that mental asylum, the techniques that were used inside the asylum.
And was it imitated elsewhere?
He tried, with the regulation. It didn't work, it didn't. They have, by 1880s, Ottoman government was bankrupt, so he was planning to organize some central asylums and small, asylums in the provinces. By that way, maybe we could reach numbers, other things. But he was not successful. He was passionate, and he was also, Mongeri. So look, he is working with De Castro. Castro was trained in Italy. He knew, the language that he was speaking. These were two guys, let's say, running, the Empire Central Mental Asylum, Avram De Castro. So, they tried hard, but it didn't work. And neither Luigi was able to, nor, De Castro. And in 1908, the Unionist government just, fired De Castro, okay? Because he was, I think they believed that he was close to Abdülhamid. So they came, and that is it. We have more loyal people. So De Castro fired, and he went to France. There's a petition, a retirement petition, probably for those people. I know that Mongeri was very disappointed. In one of his personal letters, he was saying that they do not understand what I am trying to do. They were blocking, obstructing the reform program, especially in the case of this 1876 regulation. So it was first proposed, 7 years before 1876. But it didn't work. It was on the shelves. How do we know that? Because other doctors were writing that, that document was on the shelves for 7 years. And he was almost up to give up, the reform program. I said, this is not working. They don't understand what I'm doing, so it was, still we can. Exercise.
So they're both completed now. So the point really is that you have these traditional ways of dealing with people who are sort of different in many ways, and usually that was done within the community. And what you see here is what Cihangir was talking about is really a case study of how the Tanzimat reforms in the 19th century were implemented, how they were introduced, and how effective they were. This is a very large discussion in Ottoman history, and this is one case, a case which is akin to it to an extent, is the introduction of modern European medicine, not psychiatric medicine, but actual conventional medicine. And you have the same problems here. It's not accepted very often by the popular don't work. They work to an extent. This is that's what he was trying to say is that all these things coexist. The old traditional methods and the new ones, and some of them work this way, some of them work another way. And the Sufi centers were practicing the Quran healing and exorcism, and you see how, and sometimes it works because a lot of it is really placebo type of stuff, and mentally it works. It works for a while, and it doesn't work. And then if you introduce the modern medical European treatments, sometimes when these don't work, then there's an enormous reaction to reject the entire thing, saying look at what we're doing, So this is it's a very mixed kind of an environment.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I'm aware that I write on Lake Ottoman Syria under the supervision of Professor Gündoğdu. So it seems to me that you first, in a way, these people, Castro and
Hungary. No, Hungary.
They are, in a way, they are entrepreneurs, and the history of enterprise in the late Ottoman Empire, the way I deal with it, it's a history of many hardships, and these gaps between center and periphery and urban and rural, but and modern and pre-modern, and it seems to me that you made two important or pointed two important linkages, and the first one is in the pre-modern society, Ottoman society, is between insanity as part of indecent behaviors, a group of indecent behaviors. You mentioned the beggars, dervishes, and lunatics walk around there. I think it was Damascus. And in the modern period, there was the connection between communal responsibility and pre-medicalization. This situation of pre-medicalization of insanity. And were there cases in the modern conditions, or even this thin layer of case, were there cases of people who were diagnosed as medically insane and under the supervision of their community or family? Because even though we have today a modern psychiatry, lunatics and insane people are not always segregated.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you know any cases of not necessarily a dichotomy of people who are under the supervision of their community?
So you mean someone identified as an insane person from his or her community? Diagnosed.
Yes.
And then treated in the community, not in the mental health system.
Well, for that we have to look at those, communal hospitals and the cases there. So I didn't look at, those cases, but there are definitely, there were some people who were not, peaceful, who were forwarded to the central mental asylum. Other than that, I don't remember, because I didn't look at those cases. Even though they are not, cases are, a part of those, police cases. Okay, so you see those marginalized people as long as they are part of, a legal case. Other than that, you don't see, those medical cases in detail, which would be interesting to look at, which would be interesting to study. But my cases were all of them are coming from Dahiliye, Ministry of Interior cases. So why we have those numbers soaring, overcrowding? Because after 1858 penal code, they have to send those criminals to the central lunatic asylum for a criminal license. Okay, so they are there. So there were other chronic patients there. So that was the central asylum was in a way designed to serve that modern, a state's needs. Okay, so you have modernization in the, let's say, in criminal code. So new categories were introduced. So I mean, you have to have an institution, okay? In that case, that had to deal with, like cases. But I mean, concerning your question, unfortunately, I can't say, like anything, let's say communities diagnosing, cases, patients, I can't say. There was only one case where, a Jewish rabbinate in Istanbul forwarding a Jewish woman to Toptaşı Asylum. But Toptaşı Asylum administration, Avram de Castro, I think they rejected because they said, I mean, we have no place here, okay? It's full, and they sent it back to the community, and community kept her in one of the, in rabbinate, and then again, there was a fire, something, and then they sent back again to Toptaşı Mental Asylum. So for the Greeks, there are cases, we know that Greek communal hospital did not accept 20 patients. They kept them in the prison, and at the end, that turned into a problem. So basically, communities was asking that, if you are the government, then you have to, find a solution, okay? So if this is the Central Lunatic Asylum, and if we have patients, and if we are paying taxes, so that, and after that, there was this, a budget to, expand to let's say, make the conditions of the asylum better. For your question, unfortunately, I have no particular answer.
Amy?
Thank you, Cihangir.
Thank you.
A lot of food for thought. So the things that struck me when you were speaking are a couple of things that occur that I think are very much wrapped up in the Tanzimat. So for instance, the attempt to define something on paper versus the realization of an institution for which there are very few resources.
Yeah.
Either a physical plant, financial resources, the ability to disseminate information, and the ability to get information or get people. So in a sense, it's almost as though there are two parallel projects. One, to investigate how law is written, codified, and the way definitions are changing, and the other to look at the way things are actually being implemented or not, and what the problems are there. The other thing that strikes me is that it's part of a much longer trend that Reshat Kasaba pointed out in his book, A Movable Empire, to fix in place people who had formerly been mobile. So that, he has this very big idea about how basically through the end of the 17th century, people move in the Ottoman Empire, and that's fine. In fact, it's often encouraged for a variety of reasons. And that from the 18th century, there is an increasing attempt on the part of the state to fix people in place, to categorize them more precisely, so that they can be assigned places and spaces and administered in a more effective way. It doesn't work very well for the 18th century. It starts to work much better during the Tanzimat period, but it works more and less well depending on where people are, how many resources there are, their proximity to the center, whether they're living under Midhat Pasha in one of his glorious experiments, or someplace else where nobody really is interested in the Tanzimat or has the money or time for it. So it seems to me that that's another part of what's going on. The question that I have for you among all of this is, what kind of resistance can you find to the categories as they're being put in place? That is, I mean, we know that something parallel is happening with poor people. Mine Amer's work is very good at showing that. So in terms of pushing back against these definitions of insanity as a means of controlling people, do you have any evidence in your cases or in letters or anything about people who are saying, who are either trying to be part of a category or make other people be part of categories or resist the categories in order to stay away from these
categories?
Institutions? Because I think that would get in part at the dynamics of the Tanzimat. And then just a final point about your query about 1908. Yes, I only need another 40 seconds. So we know that in the reactions of 1909 against the counter-revolution attempt in 1909, that many institutions that were identified with the Sultan were closed. So for instance, the public kitchens in Istanbul are all closed because they're funded in part through the beneficence of the Sultan. And then 2 years later, they have to all be opened again once the Libyan war starts and the Balkan war start, because there aren't any other institutions that can do the things that they do. But there's very much an attempt to shut down anything identified with the Sultan, and I'm thinking that your institution is probably part of that.
So Toptaşı was such as you mentioned, one of the institutions that was associated with Abdülhamid. Like if you read novels, if you read like newspapers, so Toptaşı for Abdülhamid, was the Bastille of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the Unionists, propagated that that was the institution where the political dissidents were kept. Okay, so after the opposition, people were kept. So after the 1908 revolution, definitely, they sent a journalist to the Toptaşı mental asylum. So in the İktam newspaper, there was a short news piece. He said that I went there, but unfortunately, I didn't find any people from political opposition, which was, like in the novels, like I think in İsyan, again, Toptaşı appears such a dungeon where, Abdülhamid keeps his, the political opposition. But I think Abdülhamid did not need to keep them. He can just simply either send them to exile or to destroy them, so that there were, as you mentioned, but Toptaşı, when the Unionists came, they tried to organize it along with their own, expectations, okay? So that institution belonged to Hamidin history part, with not good memories, so they came up with Mazhar Osman and with other people, Unionist guys, Unionist doctors, when they forced Avram de Castro to resign. So now they have more, let's say, Turkish, more, like a national, doctors or figures running the facility. I don't know whether this is an answer to your question, but with respect to the other question, resistance, which would be to these categories, to these practices, right? Which would be amazing to study, so I know one case which is not a resistance, partly resistance and not, which was Professor Schäfer knows very well, published by Fatih. Okay, so in 1890s, I think, before the cholera epidemic in Toptaşı mental asylum, you have this, employee of the Ministry of Education who was put to Toptaşı mental asylum. He says, without any, a medical explanation. He stayed there for 3 months, and after 3 months, after medical examinations completed, they said, no, you are fine, you have to go out. So when he was out in 1893, he has a long letter describing the conditions of the patients inside the asylum, which was, he depicts a horrible image of the asylum. He says basically, there is nothing there, no cure. Not treated good. They were tortured. So that was the case. So he was writing to Abdülhamid. He said, guys, look, Sultan, that is not a coincidence that we have a cholera epidemic, because I was there a couple of years ago, and what I saw there, was not that promising. So that was not a kind of resistance, maybe, but a perspective from inside, a perspective that reflects the experiences of one of the persons who sent there without any reasonable explanation, who spent 3 months. Other than that, resistance cases, we have to look at other documents, and I can't say anything. Probably there were, but I know for maybe an answer, an interesting point that I can make, we should look at the cases of, female patients, women, why they were not sent to, to the central mental asylum compared to male numbers. We know that this is not a resistance. Maybe families, kept them in, in private. I'm not sure. Okay. Why some of them were there? Who are they? Why they ended up in mental hospital? We have to think about that. But I don't want to suggest that, that there was definitely a resistance, but I cannot pinpoint, describe, or, come up with a, a reasonable explanation, which would be really interesting to look at,
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.